Hello and welcome to a video on deriving the quadratic formula by completing the square. Now in the previous few videos we've looked at the quadratic formula and we've applied it to solve quadratic equations. Now what we're going to do in this video is we're going to take the general form of a quadratic equation, which is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, and we're going to complete the square on this equation, and that hopefully is going to lead us to the quadratic formula. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just to get rid of the c, so I'm going to subtract c from both sides of my equation, and what I'm left with is ax squared plus bx equals negative c. And now in order to complete the square, the coefficient on my x squared term has to be 1. So I can't have this a here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this a, so I'm going to divide both sides by a. So if I divide this term by a, divide this term by a, and divide this term by a, what I'm left with, on the left hand side, I'm left with x squared plus b over a x, and on the right hand side I'm left with negative c over a. And now I can complete my square. So remember, to complete the square, we half the coefficient in front of x and then we square it. Half of b over a will be b over 2a, and then when I square this, that's going to leave me on the numerator I've got b squared, and on the denominator I've got 2a squared. 2 squared is 4 and a squared is a squared, so we're going to have 4a squared. So in order to complete the square I have to add on this, but remember I have to add on this to both sides of my equation. So on the left hand side of my equation I'm going to be left with x squared plus b over a x, and then plus this, so plus b squared over 4a squared. And on the right hand side of my equation I'm going to be left with b squared over 4a squared, and then subtract c over a. And notice how this is exactly the same as this. All I've done is I've added this to both sides of my equation. And now I've completed my square. This factors quite nicely. So on the left hand side, this factors to x plus b over 2a, all of that squared. And on the right hand side, I'm just going to add these fractions together. But in order to do that, I need a common denominator. So if I've got 4a squared in this fraction and just a in this fraction, I'm going to need to multiply this fraction, the top and bottom, by 4a. So if I multiply the top by 4a, I'm going to be left with minus 4ac. If I multiply the bottom by 4a, I'm going to be left with 4a squared. And now I can add these fractions together. So on the right hand side, I'm going to be left with b squared minus 4ac, and in my denominator I've just got 4a squared. And now I can square root both sides. So if I square root the left, I'm going to be left with x plus b over 2a. And on the right hand side, I'm going to be left with the plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that over 4a squared. So let me just separate this slightly just so you can see all of the steps that I've taken. Now I need to get x on its own, so I want to subtract b over 2a from both sides. So on the left I'm left with x, and on the right I'm left with negative b over 2a, plus or minus. Now the square root of this whole quantity, that's the same as the square root of the numerator divided by the square root of the denominator. So the square root of the numerator is just going to be the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Now in my denominator, the square root of 4a squared, well that's just 2a. I can simplify that. 2a times 2a is 4a squared. So we've just got 2a in our denominator. And now our final step, we can add these two fractions together because they both have a denominator of 2a. So this is going to be the same as x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and then all of that over 2a. And lo and behold, this formula here, which we can't simplify anymore, this is our quadratic formula. So what we did, we started off with our general form of a quadratic equation, and we solved this equation by completing the square. and this is what our solutions are. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that over 2a. Now if you did get slightly stuck somewhere along the line from where I went from the general form of a quadratic equation to the quadratic formula, then just have a look back through all of the steps I took and go line by line. So for example, you might not have understood why I added this to both sides of my equation, and that was all to do with completing the square. So if you're a bit unsure with completing the square, have another look through my video. I've got a video on completing the square. And once you get to your quadratic formula, this bit here is quite simple now, because all it involves is just plugging in your values for a, b and c into the quadratic formula to give you your solutions. So hopefully you found that video interesting, and hopefully it gave you a bit more of an intuition as to what this quadratic formula is all about and how we actually derive it from the general form of a quadratic equation. See you soon.